You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. Hello, folks. You're about to hear a conversation between myself and Professor John Sibley Butler, who has been described by many as America's foremost historian of black business. Professor Butler is a specialist in an avenue of American history wherein we can discern the long and proud tradition, not just of black business, but of black self-sufficiency, the building up of African American communities and institutions that have prospered even in the vicious heat of racism, and which provides, in Professor Butler's view, a formula for progress going into the future. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Professor Butler is an entertaining individual. I just love to hear the man talk. I imagine you may as well. But this conversation comes as part one of a three-part series in which I will also be speaking to Lorenzo Murphy, formerly right-hand man to drug kingpin Freeway Rick Ross, talking about the history of the crack cocaine epidemic, as it impacted the black community in black Los Angeles and his own time and career, so to speak, in that line of endeavor. And as you might imagine, it provokes some raw and gritty reflections, as well as a conversation with Joy Donnell, founder of the Center for Intersectional Media and Entertainment, to discuss the history of the entertainment industry as it is trafficked in the past and arguably in the present, and stereotypes and psychologically undermining messaging that describes a critical piece of the larger history of African American marginalization in American society, in Joy's view, a history that perhaps is not well understood. And so this three-part series is in recognition of Black History Month, but of course, let's consider this material to be relevant all year round. And now, without further ado, I give you John Sibley Butler. And I am joined today by the esteemed, the honorable, the venerable Professor John Sibley Butler of the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin, a co-contributor to the 1776 Unites Project, along with myself and many other notable individuals, Coleman Hughes, Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, brought together by the wisdom of Mr. Bob Woodson, just to name some of the parties and personalities involved. It is in that capacity that I originally came to interact with Professor Butler. I found him extremely fascinating in the few short conversations we've had behind the scenes. I expect we'll all get the opportunity to learn a great deal of value from him here today. Professor Butler, welcome, my friend.
How you doing? Good to be here. Good to see you. Absolutely. And good to be seen. Are you doing good? Right.
I am doing good. I am doing well, my friend. Blessed and highly favored, as they say. And John, it's good to have you on here in conversation. We haven't started yet, and I'm already hoping we'll be able to do it again after we're done. But John, we are here towards the end of Black. This is February 2nd when we're having this conversation. This will be out a few days from now, but towards the end of Black History Month here, bringing together a few different personalities on a few different podcasts to sort of weigh in on that broader subject. I thought that you would be a particularly interesting individual for our listeners, left and right, black and white, to hear from, because I think that telling the story of Black history has become a major preoccupation in American life, American society for many, many folks. And I don't think that's a bad thing. But we do find ourselves in the crosshairs of differing perspectives on historical emphasis, historical interpretation, historical narrative, and these things have consequences for society, broadly speaking, or so I imagine. So let me give you sort of an outline of the way in which, one of my other guests might be sort of inclined to describe African American history, the way in which, people might talk about Black history, and tell me what you think of this general sort of narrative. So let's say that American history begins, not just with the Revolutionary War in 1776, but with colonization, 1619, right? With the advent of slavery on America's shores, that the country was founded on noble philosophical sentiments deeply contradicted by the reality of slavery, in which it becomes clear that the American commitment to the idea of universal human equality, such as it shows up in the language, the poetry of the Declaration of Independence, does not manifest in the prose of the way we actually govern society. So you fast forward through centuries of slavery, but bloody civil war is fought. But even in the aftermath of that, after a hopeful but short-lived period of Reconstruction, you have African Americans continuing to be sort of imprisoned in rural poverty in the South, seeking job and employment opportunities in the North, only to find themselves shut out of much of the labor market due to the segregationist policies of labor unions. You find them sequestered into Black-only neighborhoods and communities through public housing policies that seem to be bent on accelerating segregation, not just in the South, but across the country, redlinings, things of this nature. You go through the civil rights movement, you have the emergence of a Black middle class that achieves some success and integration, Black folks moving into the universities in Hollywood and so forth, but you've got mass incarceration and decades more poverty and oppression through systemic racism in a way that makes it clear that Black American history has been one of struggle, one that has produced some notable achievements, but that is fundamentally characterized, John, by an unending status of inequality and marginalization and subjugation that we must today rebel against in an earnest effort to overcome the plague of systemic racism. I think that that's probably
yeah, that's a good starting point. But let's augment that.
Okay.
Starting with the Black middle class. Actually, what we do at the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, we have studied Black success since the 1700s. So even during the revolutionary period, of course, if you go back to Minton's work, there were Black enclaves, and I make a distinction between self-segregation, homophily, and segregation.
You referenced
somebody's work, John.
You referenced somebody's work. Who was that? You said if you go back to Minton's work, if I heard you.
Yeah, Minton, Minton. He did outstanding work entitled Blacks in Business in Philadelphia.
Got it.
So Philadelphia was the Mecca. So what we do is we don't look at what people have done to us. We look at what we've done for ourselves. And I think if you stop to worry about these things, that is, racism should be a catalyst, not to moan and groan, but to do stuff for yourself. Okay. And if you look at the history of the world, if you look at Africa, if you look at Europe, if you look at Japan, the people that we call marginalized, when they turn to business enterprise, do much better. So let's set up some scenarios and look at adjustment to the Americas and what happens. So if you go back to, I don't know, W.B. Du Bois' work, I'm a professor, so I'm going to have to quote works, right?
We're here to talk about
economic cooperation among Negroes, right? Mm-hmm. So the core of living in America is the market economy and economic success. And then if you look at that, Du Bois looked at what he called enclaves. And if you look at America, it started like that also. That is, if I'm studying business enterprise in New York in 1860 or 1870, I'm looking at little Italies, I'm looking at little German towns, I'm looking at little Scandinavian. So you trace those kinds of enclaves. So what we say is, we look at the history and how you adjust to America, what you have done through the centuries and how you adjust to America and outcomes associated with that. For example, if you look at the South, it has always had, from its inception, in a real interesting way, the more the racism, the better off Blacks are, where racism was very, very strong. Okay. For example, if you look at, let's take the state of Mississippi, it has the highest percentage of Black college graduates. If you look at all of the Southern states do, because going to college for Blacks in the South started after the 1800s with the founding of private Black schools. Before that, it was a Northern kind of phenomenon. So when you trace that, what you have to do is say, all right, what are you doing and how are you adjusting to America? Is it the right to vote? Very, very important, but it's not going to make you economically secure in America. Do you worry about who's the president? Well, it's interesting, but you can't let people kill you. What about the civil rights movement? Well, I'm from Southern Louisiana, and we started Deacons for Defense, and we rejected all of the marching, and created. And when the Klan showed up, the men in my community were armed too. So we have different kinds of situations. What you have to do. So if you look at Black America, it has always struggled in terms of method and what should be done. But what we know, what are the lessons of history that we really, really know? We know that economic enclaves are important. Now, in the old days, enclaves, take a Chinatown, right? But now that has mutated, if you will, to the internet, but it's the value structure that you create. So I'm interested if we take one variable, let's take college matriculation. Let's go back to W.E.B. Du Bois for one of his first book called The College Bred Negro, 1911. Well, what he showed was the relationship between being a merchant, right, and launching kids in different ways in America. The thing about Black America is that the legal segregation was applied to no other group. I mean, even the Irish had a hard time, even the Japanese had a time. But the thing about Black Americans, when I say legal segregation, I mean where you can put your enterprise. Okay. Again, going back to the early work, there was one time when Black enterprise were all over the city, right? You go back to New York, you go back to Philadelphia, a Black engineering firm built Philadelphia. You go to all of the southern cities, Black firms were everywhere. Because remember, there were free Blacks all over the South. There were free Blacks in North Carolina. There were free Blacks in Cane River in southern Louisiana and those kind of things. So the bad part about segregation was you could not put your money, you could not really have an opportunity to put your company downtown. That was the bad thing about segregation, right? And so what happened with that was that Black enterprise really became segregated, not voluntarily, into what we call business enclaves, and they did fabulous kinds of things. Okay, so for example, Martin King came out of Sweet Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, one of the wealthiest Black enterprises in the country, because what they did was to, they really generated among themselves the whole idea of business enterprise, and they developed a Morehouse College and Spelman College for the education of the children. If you go to Birmingham, Alabama, it was Stillman College. If you go to New Orleans, Louisiana, it was Xavier University, Dillard University, and those kind of things. Now, what all of that means is that is a model, right, for the education of children. It's a model for business enterprise. So what we do at the National Center for National Enterprise is ask another kind of question. What do we do in the face of all of this discrimination and racism? All right. What we did was to create things, created great communities. Georgetown is a great book entitled Remembering Georgetown. There's great books on Black Philadelphia. There's great books on Black New York. There are great books on New Orleans and Birmingham. So wherever discrimination and racism is the strongest, it's where Blacks are better off. Oh, by the way, wherever anti-Semitism is the strongest, it's where white Jews are better off also. Wherever Japanese on the West Coast, anti-Japanese is strongest, it's where the Japanese are better off. So if you stop to worry about racism and discrimination, I mean, you can't let people kill you, then you don't do anything to help yourself. So what if you look at the research, if you look at my book, Entrepreneurship and Self-Help, it's amazing what the ex-slaves did. It's amazing. They created private schools. They created private universities. As a matter of fact, I'll just say this. Most Black Southerners in that tradition by the 1960s were looking down on most whites in the South educationally. They had achieved better education. And now you had to do something, right, with all of these people, right, who were achieving. So if you look at the migration patterns, right, so some people went to the North for the jobs, and that was a wonderful, wonderful thing. Best jobs in the Western world, but no education institutions. Okay. Well, when they desegregated the South, then the white Southern schools were flooded also with Black Americans, but there was one difference. Those Black Americans were in third and fourth generation of college matriculation, all right? If you look at what happened in Georgia, and certainly I was in that bunch of Go Tigers, LSU, the first Black kids to go to LSU. The Black population was I'm a fourth generation college graduate. No big thing, looking down on most people who were there. And you give all that credit to the ex-slaves, right, who created private schools and private universities. So the lesson in this, John, don't stop to worry about discrimination and racism. What you have to do is concentrate on the models that would make you successful, right, in America. And let's make a distinction between segregation and self-segregation, or what we call homophily. You know, if I want to get out.
I imagine that it's possible that somebody might listen to you here and say, okay, well, it seems like Professor Butler is saying that segregation is a good thing, right? Should we now be pro-segregation and whatnot?
No, it's homophily. And what you find is the wealthier blacks get, the more they move toward homophily. What is homophily? Homophily is birds of a feather flock together, okay? It's not, nobody's going to say that you don't want legal segregation. But what happens is, you know, I have a friend, Min Zo, who did a great book on Chinatown. And Min Zo was she's a professor out in California, and they were jumping on her about Chinatown, and it was segregated. And she said, look, Chinatown will produce, right, more Ivy League scholars in New York City than anybody else, because it's a protective mechanism, right? It's a way to find jobs and opportunities, but more importantly, it's a way to shield you from the racism in the larger society. If you look at white America, if you look at what the Mormons have done, the Mormons are in this same tradition. The white Mormons were kicked out of everywhere from New York City to Chicago, went to Utah, created a business enclave, created a university called BYU. So therefore, you gotta look at the difference between legal segregation and homophily. Nobody wants legal segregation, because I said legal segregation means you can't go where you want to go and do what you want to do, right? And that's real bad. But the fact of the situation, if you look at immigrant groups, if you look at the Nigerians from Africa, they are the Igbo are the most educated group in America and also in Europe, based on the homophily principle. They are outstanding business persons based on the homophily principle. So the ideal is this, John. Here's the deal.
Yeah.
If you look at historically, what Black Americans have done, Black Americans have always been successful, despite the idea of slavery. So what Bob Woodson and I did, you know, I joined Bob Woodson because in the 1970s, because I knew and we knew that the civil rights movement would do nothing for poor people. Okay? Zero, right? Because to live in America, you have to have some income. And so we started the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise to really bring people back to the idea of the relationship between taking charge of your community, purchasing your community. Okay, so I have a colleague at 1776, Buster Soares from New Jersey. I have a chapter on Durham, North Carolina, 1920s and 1930s, outstanding Black communities. And he went in New Jersey in our lifetime and they bought the community, right? Bought all the things that were dilapidated. Now it looks like a upper middle class community. That is taking charge, buying what you can do. If you stop to worry about whatever people think about you, then you're dead. So our history is not just the history of hostility. Our history is doing well in America. And that's what we document, coming from slavery, the building of education institutions, the building of all Black towns. And the idea is that if you do that as a group, then you're much better off in America. And then you got the other model. Everybody wants opportunities, right? So we got to get past legal segregation and put the emphasis on what Black Americans do as a group. If the schools are bad, start your own school. We got a tradition of that, right? If your community is bad, buy your community, own the community, and fix it up. So that's kind of where we are at the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise.
Indeed. So John, let me attempt to recapitulate some of what you said here. What I hear you saying is that, notwithstanding this larger sort of historical overview that I started our conversation off with, one in which obviously you have the indisputable reality of slavery standing in contradiction to the words of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, notwithstanding this history of Ku Klux Klan terrorism and Jim Crow segregation and expulsion, or rather denial of entry into the labor unions and segregated housing and even mass incarceration, so on and so forth, that there is a long, proud, and prosperous history in African American society of Black self-sufficiency, harnessing the power of entrepreneurialism to build up Black towns, Black communities, Black institutions in ways that, even going as far back as you want to go in American history, defied this larger sort of regime of inequality, and some people would want to use the phrase white supremacy, in a way that provides a model that itself is reflected in the practices of other groups, including Jews, including Chinese in Chinatown, including the Ibu and others that you mentioned, which is essentially cultivates the fuller potential of the community upon the principle of homophily, this idea that through cultural cohesion and similarity, we are able to bring our own resources to bear to establish our own independence and prosperity, and that model should be what informs even our present approach to remedying larger racial inequities in society and advancing the forward progress of the Black community. Do I have your larger?
Yeah, and more importantly, we have the data. I mean, we have over 100 years of data to look at, going back to economic cooperation among Negroes by W.B. Du Bois, Enterprising Southerners. We have all of this data. So bear with me. Let me give you an equation, and let me tell you where Black Americans are. I'll say this: if you tell me where you're from and what your grandparents or great grandparents did, I can probably tell you where you are in Black America today. Okay, so let's set up the equation for the scenarios. Let's say that I was born in New Orleans, and let's say that we took off and went to Chicago. I went to Cleveland, Ohio to work in the factory jobs, which was wonderful, right? I married a girl from Cleveland, so I like Cleveland, right? But there was no support for continuity in those cities. There was no private Black colleges. They moved in behind other white groups, and there was no continuity. Okay, so therefore, when all the factories left, those cities disappeared, because it had an impact not just on Black Americans, but it had an impact on everybody who went mass migration. You know, just as many Europeans went to Chicago and Milwaukee for great jobs as Black Americans. On the other hand, if I had stayed in Southern Mississippi, and if I had gone to Tougaloo in 1890, or if I had gone to Jackson State in 1900, then you have a different kind of tradition that was developing. That tradition is based on education and innovation. So, for example, I'm a professor at the University of Texas. I do technology transfer, but Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee is the model. Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver at the turn of the century were doing what Stanford University is doing now, that is taking science and technology and creating it to wealth. They did it in agriculture. So you have two different kinds of traditions, and the traditions do bump heads, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I am a Black Southerner. I am a fourth generation college graduate. And my problem is I think I'm better than everybody. I don't think that there's one white person in the South who has my family tradition, okay? It's a tradition of wealth. Is a tradition of doing great things under legal segregation. And the reason is very, very simple. My grandfather, who was in oil and gas, just talked about, all right, Butler, you're going to go over there, you're going to LSU, get the contract and make the sheets for the Klan so the family can do well. They had a different kind of orientation. Booker T. Washington had the Negro Business League, where everybody was organized around business enterprise. So what you get with the equation, you get two kinds of traditions, okay? So right now you say, well, okay, where do people go to school? I can tell you this. I mean, most of my wealthiest friends send their kids to Xavier, Dillard, Morehouse, Spelman, Hampton, and pay themselves a big old tuition. So you got different traditions in Black American. And the question is this, let me put it like this. John, how can we make Detroit and Atlanta? How can we make Chicago and Atlanta? How can we make California, LA, and Atlanta? Or how can you make it a Durham, North Carolina? Or how can you make it? Well, here's the deal. North Carolina has more Black colleges, right, in that sector than anywhere else, okay? And their tradition is college matriculation, right? They used to serve the segregated enterprises. After desegregation, it was those kids who were able to take opportunities in the larger society. This is why when I joined the National Center or the Woodson Center, Bob and I knew that we had to have a formula, right? That would put the emphasis back on what we did under slavery, the millionaires who were slaves at one time, right? Communities that were built, right? A family structure that was developed. Now, what happens, you get conflicts in these traditions. You know, well, this person is bourgeois, and this person is labor, and this person is this, and this person is that, okay? So we have different kinds of traditions in the civil rights movement. As I said, in where I'm from, people they embraced Martin King, but it wasn't a solution, because where I'm from, people were always armed, okay? And they refused to give up their arms, and they met the Klan on their own terms. And when they showed up in their weapons, it was called the Deacons for Defense. Look it up, right? Because people don't talk about that, right?
Deacons for Defense.
John, you got these different kinds of tradition. So it's according to what you concentrate on as to where you are today. The same thing is true for Japanese in America in a little different way. Same thing is true for white Americans. So if you look at white Mormons, they're different than most white Americans. You look at white Jews, they're different. And because of the emphasis is on education, family, and you know, I studied the Igbo, and the African Igbo is going the same way. As a matter of fact, I think 90+% of all kids at Ivy League now are African or Igbo. Certainly at my school, most of the kids are African Igbo, because they have an emphasis not on what people are doing.
You mean out of John? You mean out of the Black population, some very high percentage of them are not African American?
No, no, and you can see it in athletics too. Everybody would have different experiences, but what do you do? How do you face discrimination? You better do something. If you're going to sit around and moan and groan, you go nowhere. You have to have a strategy to ask, what did people do in the 1890s to be successful? All right. Where did the institutions come from? Who started the institution? Were they good people? Were they smart people? Were they ex-slaves smart people? How could they build communities? How do we get those things for the future into a difficult, what we call at the Woodson Center, right? How do we get poor people on the same level in the future? I mean, what do? Do you do it by politics? Well, I can tell you this: it is innovation, and it is the entrepreneurship, whether small business, whether it's on the internet, or wherever have you. That is one of the most important things in creating economic stability, you know, in America. I mean, you can lay in, you can march in, you can drive in, you can do all of that, but if you don't have the economic part. And so what happened in the 1960s was that the economic part was dropped. I mean, the civil rights movement dropped the entire economic part and turned the whole emphasis on begging people to love you. That's not going to work. That's not going to work in America. What you have to do in America is to go back to the structures that put you right on the market. You know, you control what's going on in the cities, and then you create other kind of opportunities for future generations. And maybe that's private high schools, because the entire situation in Black America, if you look at the South, it was mostly the development of private schools. Mm-hmm. So, but it's interesting to look at.
One of the things that, well, John, let me pin you down on a couple of points of tension between the traditions, because you've identified the fact that there are different traditions in the Black freedom tradition within the civil rights, the historical civil rights movement, right, and movements. And you yourself, I've heard you describe yourself as being, quote, straight out of the Black bourgeoisie, right?
Yep. Wear it on my sleeve.
Wearing it
right about
on your sleeve. And so that tradition has been what you have articulated here. Of course, you trace that back to Booker T. Washington and others.
And right, and the free Blacks too. I mean, it goes way back to free Blacks, right?
Indeed. One thing that scholar, sociologist William Julius Wilson has written about is the fact that the civil rights movement historically, and certainly in the 1960s, was largely sort of a product of the Black middle class and the educated classes. And perhaps this is to your point when you talk about that movement not having focused in on the problems of the Black poor. And William Julius Wilson does credit Martin Luther King Jr. as having been one of the first in the mainstream civil rights movement to have begun to sort of see the problem with that as it approached the end of his life and career, stating that, you know, it's well and good to, you know, for a man to be able to desegregate a restaurant so he can sit at the lunch counter, but what good is it if you then cannot afford to buy a hamburger, right?
Absolutely.
Right. You have this focus on material and economic uplift, which really sort of revolves around our ability to do for ourselves as a community. Here's the point of tension I want to identify. I can imagine many folks listening to the perspective that you're offering, and I think it might even been true for Booker T way back in his day, in his clash with Du Bois, and say, okay, you know, this material uplift is well and good, but there are societal level critiques that need to be aimed at the prevailing political establishment, the prevailing systems, wherein we basically call a spade and say that this is racism in action. We need laws to remedy unjust treatment. We need reforms to see to it that people with racist attitudes and dispositions, or policies that have descended to us from agendas of racial control, are rolled back and eliminated or otherwise redesigned. If we cannot make the clear criticism of racial and moral hypocrisy in law and politics, aren't we tying an important arm behind our back if all we're doing is focusing in on economic uplift without clearly speaking truth to power?
I think so. I just, you know, I don't listen to those people. You know, my father didn't listen to them, and my grandfather didn't listen to them. So this is what you're doing. You can't have people killing you, all right? You can't have people lynching you, right? But also you cannot legislate those different kinds of things. And by the way, we have pointed that out before. It's like I'm living through, I don't know, something, early childhood again. I mean, you know, as you said, going back to Reconstruction, we had people going to Washington, D.C., and you had all of those things on the table. There's nothing wrong with criticism, right? But you just can't criticize, right? There's nothing wrong with calling people a racist, but you got to realize the big change is that I think this is the weakest white population I've ever dealt with. The white population that I dealt with, yeah, I'm racist, so what? Right? that to me, right. I'm racist, so what? So I've told people during this era that I have never seen so many weak white people in all my life who refuse to defend, right, what they didn't do, and defend in a lot of ways. So my point is this: if you look at the history, there's always been help across institutional lines, right? Whether it's colleges and universities. And by the way, you know, if somebody called me a name, I can take them to court. That's amazing to me. By the way, if I tried to move into a neighborhood and they didn't sell me a house, I could sue them. That's amazing to me. My grandfather and great-grandfather did not have that, but I can tell you that my grandfather probably lived better than me, right? And at the turn of the century in 1918, had 5 kids, sent them all to school. And so what I'm saying is that there's nothing wrong with those conversations, okay? There's nothing wrong with pointing that out. But what happens when they say, okay, yeah, we're racist, so what are you gonna do? I mean, what do you do? So you cannot have all of your resources going to try to change anybody, right? Who's a racist against you. You treat them like the trash that they are, and you do something for your own self. So at the society level, if you look at all the bills that have been passed, right, to enhance the whole idea of participation in America, right? Well, let me tell you what has happened. All of those bills, all of that civil rights have been hijacked by white Americans, all right? The government has created white minorities, right? And those include white women, right? Different sexual lifestyle of people who are white. I'm here in Texas. When I was a kid, white Mexicans were white. Now they are a minority group with government protection, which is fine because they did a good job of positioning themselves. And also the introduction of the term diversity and people of color denies Black history. There's no history of a person of color in America. there's no history of a diverse person in America. And you're going to be black, not Creole, not half white. The government said if you have some black blood, then you are black. You know, as a kid from Southern Louisiana that grew up in a black population, but most of them were half white, I understand what the Creole situation is. But the biggest thing with Black America now is that when you buy into this diversity concept, you're dead on arrival. So if you look at all the governmental programs that we fought, everything from quote, minorities in business, enterprises, everything. I mean, the University of Texas now is a minority serving institution because it's 25% Mexican American. But the University of Texas have never denied Mexican American interest to the university. They were white in the 1890s when they went in. And so you have an interesting situation. So everything that Black Americans work for, as I said, as my father would say, you know, colored people came out of slavery and created the Black colleges and universities, right? Negroes created the right to vote. Black Americans stabilized everything, and diversity of Blacks are giving it all back. So you have to realize where you are in time and space on the political structure, right? Diversity has taken the place, white diverse people, quote unquote, as certified for the government, are just as protected and can be checked out on the form as Black Americans who were denied any kind of entrance to these institutions when slavery for 500 years. So now that's the major concern that you have in terms of going future in Black America. The identification with diversity is a major, major setback for the movement of Black Americans.
Well, now you are associating that identification with diversity with I'm guessing with the impetus towards larger societal integration that Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for, the political reforms that resulted in a number of policies, including things like affirmative action, of course. And I hear you saying that, you know, these policies, the benefits of them have been distributed far beyond the group that it was originally led those efforts and for which these reforms were sort of intended. But I want to ask you, John, if I were to say that, as you know, someone like I think William Julius Wilson would argue that a policy like affirmative action, you know, as a policy that is available for groups aside from just African Americans. But if you go into the 70s, you go into the 80s and so forth, you know, as you had more African Americans actively recruited from college campuses to college campuses, that is to say, and then into corporate America, did you not have a growth in the Black middle class? Did you not have a diminishing of income inequality between educated Blacks and educated whites? Did you not have wage growth among educated African Americans participating in affirmative action programs that would expand to include others? But does expansion, including others, diminish the gains that came through policies, you know, such as affirmative action, but perhaps also just through policies across the board, desegregation being something that brings people into greater commercial interaction with each other, presumably, right?
Yes, but John, that was based on equal opportunity. That was based on equal opportunity. That wasn't based on diversity.
Okay. So
there's a difference between EEO, and they changed everything from EEO to diversity. Okay. And so if you look at my good buddy, Julius is a good friend of mine. If you look at his work, one of the things that he didn't do was he didn't look at strolling in Chicago. He didn't look at all the great enterprises that Chicago, one of the great business enclaves in America. And he just looked at when work disappears. He didn't look at how Blacks had created Chicago with the strolling that was done. It was called strolling that was done at the turn of the century. Then it went to Drake's Black Metropolis. And then, you know, the whole community, Chicago was a dynamic community. It was more than just working at factories. There were great enterprises. You know, Ebony came out of there and Jet came out of there. Insurance companies come out of there. And nobody talks about that. That is the history of Black America that would carry you along, right? Not just a movement of factories. So you got to separate EEO from diversity. And when I say that, you know, I talk to all kind of groups. You know, I talk to white female entrepreneurs and they're white. I talk to Africans and they're Africans, right? I talk to Mexicans. I have a book on Mexican-Americans, entrepreneurship, and they're Mexican. I talk to Black Americans and they're diverse. So it is the whole idea, but diversity has no history. When they call you diverse, it strips you of everything that Black Americans have done and puts you in an interesting situation where diversity has no history whatsoever. And what we do know is that homophily has been very, very important. So I don't hear other groups saying, us and other minorities. It only comes from Black Americans. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you look at bills in Washington, Black Americans and other people of color, well, I don't know what that means. Mm-hmm. Jean de color, je parle beaucoup le français. Jean de color is a Caucasian that with color, right? Mm-hmm. I'm a colored person, not a person of color. Mm. You like that?
I'm tracking the poetry very well here. I do want to ask you, John. So okay, so let me approach it this way, and I've got my eye on the clock here. But I think that many Americans feel that, certainly in this day and age, that so much of what is good about American society is the ability of American society to transcend racial and group differences in a way that make it possible for us to occupy and build communities together across the very differences of our histories. Some of us, I think, look at the movement, the civil rights movement in the 1960s, Dr. King's looking to a day when we would chant not white power, not Black power, but God's power and human power, as kind of exemplifying the American idealism of e pluribus unum, the idea that out of many we are one, right? I'm a person who comes from a biracial, multicultural family, and I mean that, quite literally. My mother is Black. She's from inner city LA. My father is white. He's from the South, small town called Gallatin, Tennessee. I had cousins on both sides of the family who were half.
Well, I do too. I mean, there's no problem. My grandmother was French. Doesn't matter.
Right. And so what I want to suss out here for anybody who gets the sense that the Black bourgeois ethos or the type of worldview that you're articulating is sort of antithetical to the formation of social arrangements and familial arrangements like that. To the extent to which a person could infer that from what it is you're saying, I want to give you the opportunity to respond to or head off that supposition, because I think that you're speaking to the value of cultural communities. And it's funny because I think, Malcolm X and Black Power folks and Black nationalists who you would more usually think of as radical, and then Booker T. Washington, and perhaps even our own Bob Woodson and other folks you would think of as conservative, sort of align on these. It's not necessarily a left versus right sort of paradigm when you talk about these two traditions exactly. So I want you to clarify sort of what, if anything, are the implications of the principle of homophily vis-a-vis our commitment to social integration and being able to enjoy the fruits of a multicultural and diverse society.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Harold Cruz had it best when he said, during integration, who are you integrating with? What whites are you integrating with? So when you pull up that curtain on white America, there are different groups, right? For the most part, it was America that was controlled by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That is, they control most of the political stuff. We've had one Catholic president, we got two now, and that was John F. Kennedy. And then we had other white groups in the economic sector, and then we had other white groups in labor. And by the way, they really, really never interacted with each other on a high level basis. So the idea is you take homophily and then you go to the larger society. Mm-hmm. So what you find is that white Americans and Black Americans who have the same economic background are more likely to interact with each other. That's what you find. Okay. If you look at, if you look at a great book called Dying of White America, dying of whiteness, is that it? Dying of whiteness, right? There have always been differences within the group. So the question is, what group do you integrate with? It's not a matter of some idea called integration. It's all driven by opportunities. Okay. So right now, all of my college friends, right? Most of my college friends are white. We go to games together, right? We pull each other, and we did that because we have certain things in common. We met in college, and we have certain things in common, and that is a great, great thing. The idea is, how do you deal with poor people, right? And the way you deal with poor people is that you have to have a model of going to the market, right, and dealing with that. You just can't make enough money yourself by not being, employed or being not being self-employed. So the idea then is that there is a model, right, that the ex-slave gave us, right, that was based around homophily, it was based around race. And then we see it with immigrants, immigrant groups today. It's based around homophily. It doesn't mean that you're shut out from the larger society, but before one can enter the larger society, perhaps as Carl Michael Hamilton said in Black Power, Politics and Liberation, there's nothing wrong with that, but you close ranks, you close ranks, and then you go forward in a competitive way. So there's nothing wrong with being in the larger society, but you must be able to compete. I mean, if you're going to compete in the larger society, where few whites compete, by the way, it is made up of different groups who have certain kind of levels of achievement that is controlling for certain kind of things. And what people call white privilege is whites who don't have those same kind of universal standards, but get the opportunity to do so. So, John, it's not a matter of saying that you don't want to be a part of society. It's how do you want to be a part of society? Right. And what we've done at the National Center is to say, look, the economy stuff is very, very important. You have to own your own neighborhoods. Black Americans sit on the best land in the Western world. I mean, I was out in San Francisco some years back, and they were telling me that it was a ghetto and they had a view of the Golden Gate Bridge. Right. What you have to do is realize where you sit, what past generations did, and maintain, as Borsasori did. Dr. Borsasori said, just maintain your community. And that's true of any kind of community in America. So the most integrated places in America are where blacks and whites have achieved, right, the same kinds of level of education. Okay, so and then of course that then goes to marriage between groups. And as I said, I'm from Southern Louisiana, we have the same thing. We have whites in the family and those kind of things. But by the way, the whites went to the white restroom and I went to the color only restroom.
Oh, even, yeah, and back in
So I think it's important, John, to realize that the idea is what we're trying to do at 1776 is, you have a whole history of success, right? The whole history of America Black America is not just protesting and calling people racist. It's taking racism and turning it upside down. And when you turn it upside down, that means historically you created education institutions, you created great communities, you created great housing, and of course you tried to launch your kids with better opportunities. So, and the other thing that has happened related to that is that the race stuff has become a commodity. I mean, it has become an industry, and so you cannot allow people who just call people names to be the industry, but you need to stress the whole history of doing well in America. And by the way, I think that's the whole country now. We have a lot of stuff. I do all the innovation entrepreneurship in my class. My MBA students have a lot of pushback on capitalism. They have a lot of pushback on market economies. And then, you deal with those intellectual questions. So I think it's very, very interesting times now.
Indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. John Sibley Butler, straight out of the Black Bourgeoisie. John, can we get you back on sometime, brother? I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
Oh, yeah. Anytime, John, I'm here. Whenever you want me there, I'll be there. I enjoy discussing these things. And I really enjoy, as we do at the National Center for Neighborhood, we're a conglomerate of poor people, but we give poor people different kind of models of how to do well. We don't want them to remain poor. We don't want to make a living off of them being poor. Indeed. And what the Wilson Center has done in cities is absolutely amazing. Even before all of this came up, we went to St. Louis and some poor women bought a big dilapidated housing project, bought it themselves, made it, I think it was Kansas City, made it their own. In a year and a half, 60 Minutes did a piece on it, how it become an upper middle class value situation. It's just a value in what you pay attention to.
Indeed. Well, we're going to drop some links in the description below so folks can follow your work, Professor Butler, but I do look forward to continuing the conversation. Maybe we can get you in a live event sometime. Maybe we can even reach out to your pal, William Julius Wilson. I haven't had the opportunity to connect with him yet, but It's great to have the privilege to be able to throw great minds together in some of these.
Yeah, he's a great guy. He's a good friend of mine.
Okay.
And I went to Northwestern. He was there. Been a friend for a long time.
There you go. There you go. All right.
Okay.
Well, to be continued, my friend. And for those who are listening to this podcast, who are interested in the work of bridging the divides between the American people, learning about who we are, our experiences, the stories we trail behind us, and the interest of creating this American project as one that brings us together from out of many one, then join Braver Angels. You can join us as a member at braverangels.org. Like and share and subscribe to this podcast. As always, we are building a house united. Until next time.